The stars burned cold and silent above Valkara Station, and Admiral Zethan of the Allery species stood on the bridge of his flagship with his four-fingered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the tactical display with growing horror. In his twin hearts, the Kreth Dominion had come without warning, their massive black warships dropping out of hyperspace like a plague of metal locusts. And within minutes, the sky above Valkara had turned dark with the hulls of enemy vessels. Zethan counted them with his luminous silver eyes and felt something cold settle in his stomach when the number climbed past 400 capital ships with thousands of smaller fighters and bombers swarming between them like angry insects. The Kreth were a species of nightmares, standing 8 feet tall with armored exoskeletons and mandibles that could crush bone. And they had conquered 67 worlds in the past decade, alone with a brutality that made even the oldest species in the galaxy shudder behind Zethan. The station floated in the void like a fragile bubble of light and life, home to 40,000 civilians who had no idea that death had come for them in the shape of obsidian warships and clicking mandibles. "Admiral," his communications officer said in a trembling voice, "the Kreth flagship is hailing us." Zethan nodded, and the main screen flickered to life, revealing the terrifying visage of Warlord Scarf the Hollow, a massive Kreth warrior whose carapace was covered in the carved symbols of his many conquests, and whose eyes gleamed with cruel intelligence. "Coalition forces." Scarvith's voice was a grinding rasp that seemed to scrape against the inside of Zethan's skull. "You have 1 hour to evacuate your personnel from this system before we claim it for the Dominion, and any vessel remaining after that time will be destroyed without mercy." The transmission cut off, and Zethan looked at his tactical display again, counting his own forces with a sinking feeling in his hearts. The Coalition had sent 60 ships to Valkara for what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic conference, and most of them were lightly armed escort vessels meant for show rather than combat, with elegant curves and polished hulls that would crumple like paper against Kreth weapons. Only one species had sent actual warships to the conference, and Zethan turned his attention to the 12 human vessels that hung in formation at the edge of the Coalition fleet. The humans were a young species, barely 300 years into their spacefaring age, and by every measure the Coalition used to judge a species, they should have been unremarkable in every way. They were soft and fragile, with no natural armor or weapons. They lived barely a century before their bodies failed them, and their homeworld was a chaotic mess of extreme weather and dangerous predators that should have killed them off long before they ever reached the stars. And yet something about them had always made Zethan uneasy, a quality he could never quite name, but that seemed to lurk behind their small eyes like fire, waiting to catch. The human flagship was called the HSS Defiance, and it looked like someone had built a warship out of spare parts and raw determination. All sharp angles and exposed weapon systems and armor, plating that bore the scars of dozens of battles. Its captain was a woman named Elena Vasquez, and Zethan had met her once at a diplomatic function where she had smiled politely and made small talk while her dark eyes catalogued every exit and tactical advantage. In the room, now her face appeared on his secondary display as she opened a channel to the Coalition command frequency, and Zethan noticed that she was holding a cup of some dark human beverage and looking at the Kreth armada with an expression that could only be described as interested. "Admiral Zethan," she said in a casual tone that seemed wildly inappropriate for the situation. "I assumed you received the same message we did." "I did, Commander Vasquez," Zethan replied, "and I am ordering all Coalition forces to execute an immediate tactical retreat to the Sindara corridor where we can regroup and call for reinforcements." He watched the human captain take a slow sip of her drink and raise one eyebrow in an N. expression that humans use to convey skepticism or amusement. Retreat, she repeated the word, like she was tasting it and finding it unpleasant. And what about the 40,000 civilians on that station who cannot possibly evacuate in time? Zithan felt shame burn through him, but he pushed it aside because a commander had to think of the greater good and not of the lives that would be lost in the pursuit of it. There is nothing we can do for them, he said in a voice that he hoped sounded steady. We are outnumbered nearly 7-1, and our fleet is not equipped for a battle of this magnitude. Commander Vasquez set down her cup and stood up from her captain's chair. And Zithan watched her crew snap to attention with a precision that spoke of iron discipline and absolute trust in their commander. Coalition command, she said in a voice that carried across every frequency. The Human Systems Alliance respectfully declines your order to retreat. Zithan felt his twin hearts stutter in shock as he watched the 12 human ships break formation and begin to accelerate not away from the Kreth Armada, but directly toward it. Commander Vasquez, he said with urgency flooding his voice, this is madness and you will be destroyed. The human captain turned to look at the camera and smiled. And Zithan saw something ancient and fierce blazing behind her eyes. Something that made him understand, for the first time, why humans had survived their death. World when by all logic they should have perished. Admiral, she said with warmth that somehow made her words more terrifying rather than less. We appreciate your concern, but I think you misunderstand the situation. She cracked her knuckles with a series of small popping sounds, and her bridge crew began to laugh. Actually laugh, as they accelerated toward 400 enemy warships. We are not trapped in here with them, Commander Vasquez said as the first Kreth weapons began to charge. They are trapped in here with us. Her communications officer broadcast her next words on all frequencies, including the Kreth command channel, and they would echo through history for centuries to come. This is Commander Elena Vasquez of the HSS Defiance to all Kreth forces, she announced with terrible joy in her voice. You have threatened 40,000 innocent lives, and we are here to inform you that you have made a serious mistake. Warlord Scarveth's grinding laughter filled the channel as he responded with contempt dripping from every word. 12 ships against 400, he said with amusement. Your species truly is as foolish as the reports claim, and we will enjoy adding your skulls to our collection. Commander Vasquez picked up her cup and took another sip before answering in a voice as calm as still water. You seem to think this battle is already over, she said with a smile that showed her teeth. But I have to tell you something important. She set down the cup, and her smile grew wider as the Defiance's weapon systems hummed to life. We are just getting warmed up. The first human missiles launched into the void, and the Battle of Valkara Station began. The first human missiles struck the Kreth formation like hammers against glass, and 3 enemy cruisers vanished in blooms of orange fire before anyone on either side had time to take a breath. Admiral Zithan watched from the bridge of his flagship as the 12 human ships punched into the enemy armada like wolves diving into a flock of sheep. Except these sheep had fangs and claws and outnumbered the wolves by more than 30-1. Impossible, his tactical officer whispered as a human destroyer named the Relentless tore through a Kreth battlecruiser with a barrage of kinetic rounds that shredded armor, plating like it was made of wet paper. They should be dead already, but the humans were not dead, and Zithan found himself unable to look away as commander. Vasquez led her tiny fleet in a dance of destruction that defied everything he had learned about space combat in his 200 years of service. The Kreth fought with overwhelming force, sending wave after wave of fighters at the human ships, filling the void with weapons fire until the space between the fleets glowed with the light of 1,000 suns. The humans fought back with something that Zithan could not name at first, something that made no tactical sense, but somehow worked anyway. Human frigate called the Iron took a direct hit to its engine section and began to spin out of control. And Zithan expected its crew to abandon ship or surrender, or do any of the reasonable things that a crew should do when their vessel was crippled. Instead, the frigate's captain, a young man barely 30 years old by human counting, ordered his crew to rout all remaining, power to weapons, and used the spin to rake fire across 6 different Kreth vessels as he corkscrewed through their formation 3. Of those vessels exploded, and 2 more were left drifting and helpless before the Iron Will finally went dark. And even then, its escape pods launched not toward safety, but toward the nearest Kreth ship, where the surviving crew intended to board and continue fighting. "What are they doing?" Zithan said in a voice that trembled with something between fear and awe. "This is not how wars are fought." His first officer, an elderly Alari named Vethrin, who had seen more battles than most species saw in 10 generations, stood beside him with his silver eyes wide and his mouth hanging open in an expression of pure shock. "They are not fighting a war," Vethrin said slowly as understanding dawned on his ancient features. "They are making a statement." Commander Vasquez's voice crackled over the communication system as she coordinated her fleet with a casual efficiency that made the chaos around her seem almost ordinary. "Relentless. I need you to draw fire from that carrier group on our starboard side," she said, while her own ship shuddered under the impact of enemy weapons. "Thunderchild, get me a firing solution on that dreadnought and put everything we have into its reactor core." "Copy that." "Commander," a cheerful voice responded, "we will light them up like a birthday cake." Zithan listened to the human communications and felt his understanding of the universe shift beneath him like sand under a wave. Humans were joking, actually making jokes as they flew into the teeth of an enemy force that should have crushed them in seconds, laughing and teasing each other as explosions bloomed around them, and their ships accumulated damage that would have sent any other species running for safety. A human pilot whose fighter had lost both wings was singing something, an old Earth song about a creature called a phoenix that burned and rose again from its own ashes. And she kept singing even as she guided her crippled craft toward a Kreth cruiser's vulnerable engine array. "You know," Commander Vasquez said to her bridge crew as the Defiance took another hit that knocked out half their sensor array, "I always wondered what it would feel like to be in one of those old war movies my grandfather used to watch." Her weapons officer, a large man with a shaved head and a smile that seemed far too happy for the situation, laughed as he programmed another firing solution. "Is it everything you hoped for, Commander?" Vasquez ducked as a console behind her exploded in a shower of sparks, and then straightened up with soot on her face and fire in her eyes. "It is even better," she said with genuine enthusiasm. "Now let us show these bugs what happens when they pick a fight with humanity." The Kreth were not prepared for this, and Zithan could see their confusion in the way their formation began to waver and shift as ship after ship fell to human weapons that should not have been able to touch the warlord. Scarvith's voice boomed across the communication channels, filled with rage that poorly masked a growing edge of something that might have been fear. "Kill them," he screamed at his captains. "They are nothing but soft-skinned insects, and I want them destroyed now." But the humans would not die, and every ship the Kreth destroyed seemed to cost them 3 or 4 of their own vessels in return as human crews fought, until their last breath, and then found ways to fight even longer. The HSS Valor lost its bridge to a direct hit, and its executive officer took command from engineering, fighting the ship from a cramped room filled with pipes and machinery, while damage reports scrolled across screens that flickered with each impact. HSS Nemesis had its weapons knocked out and responded by ramming a Kreth destroyer at full speed, both ships vanishing in an explosion that took out 2 more enemy vessels. that were too close to escape the blast, and through it all, Commander Vasquez kept her fleet moving and fighting, and dying and refusing to give up, her voice steady and calm as she issued orders. That sent her people into fire and death without a moment of hesitation. "Admiral Zithan," she said during a brief pause in the combat, as the Kreth regrouped for another assault. "I notice that your fleet is still sitting back there doing nothing." Zithan felt shame burn through him again, and he struggled to find words that would explain his hesitation without sounding like the coward he suddenly felt himself to be. "Commander, we cannot possibly make a difference against those numbers, and our ships are not designed for combat of this intensity." Vasquez's laugh was sharp and bright and completely without mockery. "Admiral, let me tell you something about humans," she said as the Kreth began their next wave. "We did not become a spacefaring species by waiting for the odds to be in our favor." She paused to order a torpedo spread that gutted a Kreth carrier, and then turned back to the camera with blood running from a cut on her forehead that she did not seem to notice. Every great thing humanity has ever accomplished happened because someone looked at impossible odds and said, "Let us try anyway," and then refused to stop trying until they won or died. Her smile was tired now, but no less fierce than it had been at the start of the battle. "We are not asking you to save us, Admiral," Commander Vasquez said as her ship shook under another barrage. "We are asking you to help us save those 40,000 people who are counting on someone to give a damn about whether they live or die." She turned away to deal with another crisis and left Zithan alone with his thoughts and his shame and the growing realization that he was watching something that would change the galaxy forever. 3 hours into the battle, and the void around Valkara Station had become a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen corpses. And still, the humans refused to break Commander Elena. Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Defiance, with her uniform torn and her face covered in soot and dry blood, watching her tactical display with eyes that burned with a fire that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. She had started with 12 ships, and now she had 7. But those 7 ships had destroyed more than 90 Kreth vessels and crippled dozens more. A kill ratio that should have been impossible, and yet there it was written in fire and death across the battlefield. "Commander," her first officer said through a voice, hoarse from shouting orders over the din of battle. "The Indomitable has lost main power and is drifting toward the enemy formation." Vasquez opened a channel to the crippled ship and heard the voice of Captain Marcus Webb, a man she had served with for 15 years, and who had been best man at her wedding. "Elena," he said with a calmness that told her everything she needed to know about his situation. "We have lost engines and life support is failing, but our weapons are still operational. Marcus, we can send a rescue shuttle if you can hold out for 10 minutes. Webb laughed. And it was the same laugh he had used at the academy when someone told him he was too short to be a starship captain. "Negative, Commander. We have maybe 5 minutes of air left, and I am not going to waste them waiting for a ride that might not make it." There was a pause, and Vasquez heard him giving orders to his remaining crew, calm and steady and completely without fear. "We are going to plant ourselves right in the middle of their formation and make them regret every decision that led them to this moment." Webb said, "Give them hell for me, Elena. You give them hell first." Marcus, the Indomitable, used its remaining maneuvering thrusters to position itself at the heart of a Kreth cruiser formation and then opened fire with everything it had left, its guns blazing in every direction as its crew made their last stand in silence because they had no air left to speak. 6 Kreth cruisers died before the Indomitable finally went dark. And when the explosion came, it took 2 more enemy ships with it. Vasquez allowed herself one moment of grief, one heartbeat where she felt the weight of her friend's death settle onto her shoulders alongside all the others. And then she pushed it down and locked it away, because she could mourn later if she survived right now. She had work to do. All ships. She said with steel in her voice, tighten formation around the Defiance, and prepare for Assault Pattern Omega. Commander. Assault Pattern Omega is a suicide run, her tactical officer said without any objection in his tone. Just a simple statement of fact. I am aware of what it is, Lieutenant. Do you have a problem with that? The man smiled and cracked his knuckles in an unconscious mirror of her own habit. No, ma'am. Just making sure we are all on the same page. On the Kreth flagship, Warlord Scarf stared at his tactical display with his mandibles clicking, in a rhythm that his crew had learned to associate with extreme agitation. He had lost nearly 100 ships to a force that should have been destroyed in the first 5 minutes of combat. And every time he thought he had the humans cornered, they found some new way to hurt him. Warlord, his tactical advisor said in a careful voice, the humans are reforming for another attack. I can see that you fool, Scarf snarled. What I want to know is why they are not dead yet. The advisor had no answer, because there was no answer that made sense. Not according to any military doctrine the Kreth had ever developed. The humans should have surrendered hours ago, when it became clear they could not win. But they kept fighting even when their ships were crippled, and their crews were dying, and any rational species would have accepted defeat. It was as if they did not understand that they were supposed to lose. Or perhaps they understood, and simply did not care. Warlord. Another officer spoke up with confusion, evident in his voice. We are intercepting human communications, and they are still making jokes. What? They are joking, Warlord. And laughing and making references to something called movies, which appear to be fictional stories about warfare. Scarf felt something cold creep into his heart. Something he had not felt since he was a young warrior facing his first battle. It was fear. And he hated the humans for making him feel it. On the Coalition flagship Admiral, Zithan had been listening to the human communications as well. And what he heard filled him with a confusing mixture of horror and admiration. A human engineer, whose ship was venting atmosphere, had sealed herself in a damaged compartment to buy her crewmates time to escape. And she was using her last minutes of oxygen to tell her friends about a vacation she had taken as a child. A fighter pilot with no ammunition left was playing music over his communication channel, something loud and aggressive that seemed to match his flying as he used his fighter as a battering ram against Kreth bombers and Commander Vasquez. Her ship damaged and her crew dying around her. Was telling stories about her grandfather, who had fought in something called the Martian Campaign, and had always said that the only battle you truly lose is the one where you stop trying. They are not afraid. Zithan said with wonder in his voice, they know they are going to die, and they are not afraid. His first officer, Vethrin, stood beside him with his ancient eyes fixed on the human ships as they formed up for what could only be a final desperate charge. It is not that they are not afraid. Vethrin said slowly, I think they are afraid, but they have decided that fear does not get to make their decisions for them. He turned to look at Zithan with something new in his expression, something that looked almost like hope. Admiral, we have sat here and watched these humans fight and die for people they have never met, for a station full of strangers who mean nothing to them except that they are innocent and in danger. What are you suggesting? Old friend, I am suggesting that perhaps we have been thinking about this battle all wrong, Vethrin said. We calculated that we could not win, and so we decided not to fight. But the humans calculated the same odds, and decided that the odds did not matter. Zithan looked at the tactical display and saw the 7 remaining human ships begin their charge. A handful of battered vessels flying straight into the teeth of a force that still outnumbered them by more than 40-1. They are going to die, he said quietly. Yes, Vethrin agreed. But they are going to make it mean something. And when the history of this day is written, they will be remembered as heroes, while we will be remembered as the species that ran away and left them to fight alone. The old Allery placed his hand on Zithan's shoulder, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Is that the legacy you want to leave? Admiral, is that how you want the Allery to be remembered? Zithan felt something shift inside him, something ancient and proud that had been sleeping beneath centuries of caution and careful diplomacy. No, he said with sudden certainty. No, it is not. He straightened his spine and turned to his communications officer with fire kindling in his silver eyes. Open a channel to all coalition vessels. The weight of history pressed down on him as he prepared to speak. And he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. But for the first time since the Kreth arrived, Admiral Zithan was not afraid. Admiral Zithan's voice echoed across every coalition ship, steady and clear despite the fear that still lingered at the edges of his hearts. All coalition vessels. This is Admiral Zithan, and I am issuing new orders effective immediately. He paused and looked at the tactical display where 7 human ships were charging into the heart of an enemy armada that had already killed 5 of their sister vessels and showed no signs of mercy. For the past 3 hours, we have watched the humans fight and die for a station full of people. They have never met, Zithan continued. We have watched them laugh in the face of death and refuse to surrender, even when all logic said they should have given up long ago. His silver eyes moved across his bridge crew, and he saw the same mixture of shame and awakening courage that he felt burning in his own chest. I ordered a retreat because I believed we could not win. But the humans have shown me that winning is not the only thing that matters. He straightened his spine and let his voice ring with authority that came from somewhere deeper than rank or protocol. All coalition vessels, reverse course and form up on the human battle line. And may whatever gods you believe in forgive us for taking so long to find our courage. For a moment, there was silence across the fleet. And then the communication channels exploded with responses as ship after ship confirmed the order and began to turn their bows toward the enemy on the bridge of the Defiance. Commander Vasquez heard the transmission and felt something warm bloom in her chest that cut through the exhaustion and grief that had been weighing her. Down, Commander, her communications officer said with wonder in his voice. The coalition fleet is coming. Vasquez looked at her tactical display and saw 50 ships, breaking formation and accelerating toward the battle, their weapons powering up and their shields activating as they prepared to join the fight they had abandoned hours ago. Well, she said with a smile that hurt her cracked and bleeding lips. Better late than never. She opened a channel to Admiral Zithan and did not bother to hide the tears that were streaming down her face and mixing with the blood and soot that covered her skin. Admiral, the Human Systems Alliance welcomes your assistance, and I have to say that your timing is absolutely perfect. Zithan's image appeared on her screen, and she saw that he was smiling, an expression that looked strange on his angular features, but somehow right at the same time. Commander Vasquez, I want to apologize for leaving you to fight alone, and I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the example you have set today. Admiral, we can have a feelings talk later if we survive this, but right now, I need you to bring your ships in on our starboard flank and hit that carrier group that has been giving us trouble. Understood, Commander. Coalition fleet moving to engage. 50 ships joined the battle, and the tide began to turn in ways that neither side had expected. Kreth had been wearing down the human vessels through sheer numbers, accepting their losses as the price of eventual victory. But the arrival of the coalition forces threw their calculations into Chaos Warlord Scarf, watched his tactical display with growing fury as ship after ship reported damage or destruction. His careful battle plans crumbling under the combined assault of species that should have been fleeing for their lives. impossible. He snarled as a Torvani cruiser crippled, one of his battleships with a barrage of plasma fire. The Coalition vessels are not equipped for combat, Warlord, his tactical advisor said in a voice that trembled with something that might have been fear. They are fighting like humans, and it was true. Zithan's fleet had abandoned all pretense of caution and was throwing themselves at the Kreth, with a ferocity that seemed to have been borrowed from their human allies. An Allery destroyer put itself between a Kreth dreadnought and the crippled HSS Thunderchild, taking hits that should have destroyed it, while the human ship limped to safety. A Vethrani science vessel with almost no weapons flew directly into a Kreth fighter formation and detonated its reactor core, taking out dozens of enemy craft in a suicide run that shocked everyone who witnessed it. And through it all the humans kept fighting. 7 ships reduced to 5, and then 4 as the battle raged. But each loss seemed only to make the survivors fight harder. Commander Vasquez had lost count of how many times her ship should have been destroyed, how many systems had failed and been brought back online through the desperate work of her engineering crews, how many of her people had died at their posts and been replaced by others who stepped up without hesitation. The Defiance was barely a ship anymore, more a collection of broken parts held together by emergency welds in the sheer refusal of its crew to accept defeat. But its weapons still fired, and its engines still burned, and that was all that mattered. Commander, her tactical officer shouted over the sound of another explosion somewhere in the ship. The Kreth flagship is moving to engage. Vasquez looked at her display and saw Scarveth's massive dreadnought pushing through the battle toward her battered vessel, its weapons charging for what would surely be a killing blow. All ships. This is Commander Vasquez, she said with calm that surprised even herself. I am ordering you to focus fire on the enemy flagship, Commander. If we do that, we will be leaving ourselves exposed to the rest of their fleet. I know. But if we can take out Scarf, then maybe the rest of them will lose their nerve. She did not mention that this was a desperate gamble with almost no chance of success, because her crew already knew that and had chosen to follow her anyway. The Defiance turned to face the Kreth flagship and commander. Vasquez felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment settle onto her shoulders like a familiar burden aside. The Coalition ships formed up in a ragged line, Allery and Torvani and Vethrani vessels flying alongside what remained of the human fleet, all of them battered and burned and refusing to give up. Admiral Zithan, Vasquez said as the enemy dreadnought loomed larger in her view screen. It has been an honor fighting alongside you. The honor is mine, Commander. And whatever happens next, I want you to know that the galaxy will never forget what you have done here. Today, Warlord Scarveth's voice cut across the communication channels, filled with rage and contempt. You think you have won something, he snarled as his weapons locked on to the Defiance. You have won nothing but a more painful death, Vasquez laughed, and it was a sound that seemed to echo through the void with all the defiance that humanity had ever shown in the face of impossible odds. You still do not understand, do you? She said as her ship shook under the first impacts of enemy fire. We were never trying to win. She leaned forward in her chair, and her voice dropped to something that was almost gentle. We were trying to show the galaxy that some things are worth dying for. And I think we have done that pretty well. The combined fleet opened fire on the Kreth flagship, and the void lit up with the light of 100 weapons. And somewhere in the chaos of battle, Commander Elena Vasquez smiled, because whatever happened next, she knew that her people had done something that would be remembered forever. They had shown the galaxy what it meant to be human. The Kreth flagship burned like a dying star as this combined fire of the human and Coalition fleet tore through its armored hull with relentless fury. Warlord Scarf stood on his bridge and watched his tactical display fill with warning. Lights as system after system failed, his massive claws gripping the arms of his command throne so tightly that the metal began to bend under the pressure. "Warlord, we must retreat," his tactical advisor screamed over the sound of explosions and tearing metal. "The fleet is breaking apart." Scarf turned his compound eyes toward the viewscreen where the battered form of the HSS Defiance hung in the void like a ghost that refused to die. And he felt something he had never experienced in his long career of conquest and brutality. He felt defeat. "How?" he said in a voice that was almost a whisper. "How did they do this?" His ship shuddered as another volley struck its engines, and the lights on the bridge flickered and died, leaving only the red glow of emergency systems to illuminate the faces of his dying crew. "They are humans." "Warlord," his advisor said with something like awe in his voice. "And I do not think they know how to give up." The final blow came from the HSS Defiance itself. A full spread of torpedoes that punched through the flagship's weakened shields and detonated. Inside its reactor core, Warlord Scarf the Hollow, conqueror of 67 worlds and terror of the Outer Rim, died in fire and silence as his ship tore itself apart around him. And with his death, the Kreth fleet broke commander. Vasquez watched from her ruined bridge as the enemy ships began to turn away, their formation dissolving into chaos as each captain tried to reach the safety of hyperspace before they could be destroyed. "They are running," her tactical officer said with disbelief in his voice. "They are actually running." Vasquez slumped back in her chair and let out a breath that seemed to carry all the tension and fear and desperate hope of the past 7 hours. "Do not pursue," she ordered in a voice that cracked with exhaustion. "Let them go. Commander, we could finish them if we pressed the attack." "No," she said with certainty that came from somewhere beyond strategy or tactics. "They need to go home and tell their people what happened here today. They need to tell them what it costs to threaten innocent lives under human protection." She looked at the view screen where the remaining enemy ships were vanishing into hyperspace, and her lips curved into a tired smile. Let them run, and let them remember. When the last Kreth ship had fled, and the void around Valkara Station fell silent, the survivors took stock of what they had lost and what they had won. The human fleet had been reduced to 4 ships, and even the Defiance was barely holding together as her engineering crews worked frantically to keep life support running. 241 Kreth vessels had been destroyed, a number that seemed impossible until you counted the debris fields that stretched across the system like monuments to human stubbornness, and Valkara Station floated untouched in the void, its 40,000 civilians safe, because a handful of humans had decided that their lives mattered more than the odds. Admiral Zethan came aboard the Defiance 3 hours after the battle ended, and he found Commander Vasquez in her ready room, being treated for burns and broken ribs and a concussion that she had apparently been ignoring since the 2nd hour of combat. "Commander," he said with formality that could not quite hide the emotion in his voice, "on behalf of the Galactic Coalition, I want to thank you for what you and your people have done." Vasquez waved off the medic who was trying to bandage her arm and stood up to face him, swaying slightly but refusing to show weakness. "Admiral, we were just doing our job." "No," Zethan said with conviction. "You were doing something far more important than that." He stepped forward and extended his hand in the human gesture of respect that he had learned during his years of diplomatic service. "You showed us what courage really looks like, and you reminded us that there are some things worth fighting for, even when you cannot win." Vasquez took his hand and gripped it firmly, and for a moment the two commanders stood in silence as the weight of everything that had happened settled around them. "Admiral, I lost 8 ships and over 2,000 people today," she said quietly. "I gave orders that sent my friends to their deaths and watched them die without being able to help." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. because she needed him to understand. I do not feel like a hero right now. I feel like someone who got very lucky and watched too many good people pay the price for it. Zithan nodded slowly, and his silver eyes were soft with understanding. That feeling will never go away completely, he said, but I think you will find that it helps to know that their sacrifice meant something. He gestured toward the window where Valkara Station hung in the distance, its lights twinkling peacefully as if nothing had happened. 40,000 people are alive because of what you did today, Commander, and the galaxy has learned that humanity is not a species to be underestimated. In the weeks that followed the battle, the recordings were released to the public, and the galaxy watched in stunned silence as the truth of what had happened at Valkara Station became known. They saw 12 human ships charge into an armada of 400 without hesitation. They heard Commander Vasquez declare that she was just getting warmed up while facing impossible odds, and they watched human crews fight and die with jokes on their lips and songs in their hearts. The Kreth Dominion went quiet after the battle. Their expansion halted as their leaders struggled to explain how they had lost nearly half their invasion fleet to a force that should have been crushed in minutes. Other species began to look at humans differently, no longer seeing the soft and fragile creatures they had dismissed, but something far more dangerous, a species that ran toward danger instead of away from it, that laughed in the face of death and refused to surrender, even when all hope was lost. The coalition officially adopted a new principle in their defensive doctrine, taken from something Commander Vasquez had said during the battle. When you cannot win, make sure they never forget the cost. And in cantinas and trade stations across the galaxy, beings of all species raised their glasses to the humans of Valkara Station, to Commander Elena Vasquez and her crew, and to the 8 ships that had given everything so that others might live. Commander Vasquez attended every funeral personally, standing with the families of her fallen crew and sharing stories about the people they had lost. And she never once tried to hide her tears or pretend that the victory had been worth the price. But sometimes, late at night, when she stood on the bridge of the rebuilt Defiance and looked out at the stars, she allowed herself to feel something like pride. They had faced the darkness and refused to blink. They had shown the galaxy what humanity was made of, and they had saved 40,000 innocent lives through nothing but stubbornness and courage, and the absolute refusal to give up. The Kreth had demanded that the humans retreat, and the humans had responded by teaching the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Some species fight because they think they can win. Humans fight because they believe some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds, and that made all the difference.